Let's take a look at the Silverface Super Reverb. Of course, the Silverface Super Reverb and the Blackface Super Reverb, as well as the Twin, Bandmaster, Pro, almost all the Blackface Fenders had a similar layout. And like all amplifiers, they have the inputs opposite from the power. So you have your input goes into a preamp tube. These preamp tubes are 12AX7 style tubes, which have actually two tubes in one. So it goes through the first half of that tube. It's amplified and sent over to the tone stack and volume control. From here, the signal is routed back to the other half of the 12AX7. It's then amplified, and you can see right here as it comes out of this tube, you can see it goes right along this wire to the phase inverter. That's this channel, what we've talked about so far. The other channel uses the next tube, which would be this tube here. The input jack comes over to the preamp tube just as the first channel, exactly the same. It's then amplified, goes through the tone circuit, the volume control, and back to the other side of the tube. The rest of the preamp tubes are used for reverb send, a reverb recovery, and mix tube, and of course you have your vibrato tube. This last preamp tube is a phase inverter tube, and one half of it is feeding the first output tube. The other half of it is feeding the second output tube. Both output tubes are connected to the output transformer, which is located on the underside of the chassis with the caps. And you can see the output transformer right here. We can take this off. There's 4 screws holding it on. If we lift this cap pan, and you can see the bubbled spots on the positive end of the caps. On this particular amp, the positive end on this one is over here, and it is also bubbled. How do we know a filter cap? Well, the electrolytic caps in an amp are going to be marked with a polarity mark, a plus sign. The plus sign goes to the high voltage, the minus sign goes to ground. Actually, these don't have a minus sign, but the one that's not marked is minus. There are other filter caps in the amp. You have the filter cap for the bias supply. We have the bias cap here. In this particular amp, there are actually 2 bias caps. And then, of course, you also have electrolytic bypass caps on the board. On this particular amp, it's these little white ones here. They too are marked with a plus sign on the positive end. That's one way you can identify them as electrolytic capacitors. More on this later. We'll talk about this more when we talk about cap jobs. Another classic example would be the 4-input Marshall guitar amplifier head. In this classic guitar amp, you have your inputs for 2 channels, 2 inputs for each channel. Here, these inputs, each set feeds a side of a 12AX7. This pair feeding this side, this pair feeding this side. The signal is then amplified and it's sent to a pair of volume controls. The volume controls are mixed together and they feed the second tube, which in turn feeds the tone stack, which in turn mixes together and feeds the phase inverter tube. This side of the phase inverter tube is feeding these two output tubes. The other side of the phase inverter tube is feeding these two output tubes. This pair feeds the output transformer, as does this pair. And of course your output transformer feeds the speakers. The first pair connects to the primary of the output transformer, and the other pair also connects to the other end of that same primary. Your power supply connects to the center tap of that transformer. In this amp, the power supply begins with the AC line cord, which in turn feeds the power transformer. This power transformer steps up the AC voltage and sends it all the way over here to the solid state bridge rectifiers. There's 4 little diodes here. This converts it to DC. Now this DC is smoothed out by the filter caps, and you've got 4 of them here, and there's also one under the circuit board, and you have one over here, right down in there. These filter caps are different than the Fender filter caps. These are called canister filter caps, and they look like canisters. There's 6 of them. So basically, knowing that the signal goes from one side to the other side is very important, because when we get to the troubleshooting section later on, we're going to want to isolate where the actual problem occurs.